The good news is we build 80% of our vehicles in the U.S., so we're the least affected and the most able to absorb them. We're doing everything we can.
Ford just made a shocking deal with Canada and betrayed the United States. While headlines focused on tariffs and speeches, something far more dangerous happened behind closed doors. A secret deal with Canada, billions redirected, and now factories, jobs, and power are vanishing from the U.S. without warning. But here's the part nobody's talking about. This isn't just corporate strategy, it's your economy on the line. What does Ford's pivot mean for your job, your car, your cost of living? Why was Washington too late to stop it? And what happens to American auto power if this becomes the new normal? Because by the time this video ends, you'll realize this isn't a normal trade deal. It is the beginning of something worse. Ford's quiet move to Canada. No press release, no loyalty. There was no press conference, no ribbon cutting, no staged handshake photo op with workers in hard hats. When Ford Motor Company signed a multi-billion-dollar agreement with the governments of Ontario and Quebec, it did so behind closed doors. The documents were filed, the subsidies locked in, and the blueprints drawn before most Americans even knew a deal existed. By the time it hit newswires, the machinery was already on the move, literally. Factory equipment and workforce planning were shifting northward. Ford's plan was deliberate. It wasn't just an expansion, it was a relocation. The company would build its next-generation electric vehicle and battery production facilities not in Michigan, not in Ohio, but across the border, in Canada. The move included billions in investment, thousands of promised jobs, and a long-term supply chain strategy that would anchor Ford's electric future far from its American base. The betrayal was more than symbolic. Ford was born in Detroit. Its very identity is intertwined with American labor, American roads, and American legacy. Yet here it was, charting a new course without informing the workers, communities, or leaders who had built it. Cities like Dearborn, Flint, and Flat Rock had weathered decades of layoffs and plant closures, with the belief that someday reinvestment would return. Instead, Ford made its biggest move in decades and left its most loyal people behind. And this wasn't an accident. It was strategy. Ford saw the political storms coming. It knew American infrastructure bills were stalled, U.S. labor costs were rising, and domestic supply chains were unreliable. Meanwhile, Canada had spent the last 10 years building a clean tech industrial corridor with targeted incentives and rapid permitting. Ontario promised subsidies. Quebec offered lithium access. And unlike Washington, Ottawa delivered. The silence around the move wasn't hesitation, it was insulation. Ford didn't want to invite outrage until the facts were irreversible. It didn't want debate. It wanted momentum, and it got it. Now the fuse was lit. As the news leaked beyond industry circles, it reached the only person guaranteed to explode. Trump's 200% tariff threat goes nuclear. President Donald Trump was speaking at a rally in western Pennsylvania when the whispers reached him. Within minutes, the script changed. Trump walked off the teleprompter and stared directly into the camera. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. With the crowd on edge, he dropped the line that would dominate headlines across the country. If Ford thinks it can build cars in Canada and ship them back here, they're about to learn what a 200% tariff feels like. It wasn't just political theater. It was a nuclear warning, a shot across the bow of every corporation, even thinking about shifting production outside U.S. borders. In Trump's view, Ford's move wasn't a business decision. It was betrayal, and betrayal demanded punishment. Within hours, the campaign's official channels echoed the threat. A press release accused Ford of abandoning American workers, selling out to foreign governments, and jeopardizing national security. Trade advisors hinted that Ford's new Canadian-built electric vehicles would be effectively blocked from re-entering the U.S. market unless they paid punitive tariffs that would make them unsellable. Cable news exploded. Financial pundits debated whether Trump could legally enforce the tariffs. Union leaders held emergency calls with the White House. The Ford boardroom, according to insiders, went into full lockdown. The company had expected pushback. It had not expected this level of retaliation, not this quickly, and not this surgically targeted. But the Trump administration was not operating on technicalities. It was operating on optics and power. The president had built his identity on protecting American manufacturing. With Ford's move to Canada, he was handed the perfect storm. A brand-name company, a working-class betrayal, and a border-crossing deal that looked, on the surface, like pure disloyalty. The message to corporate America was unmistakable. Move jobs out and you will be called out by name. Move production overseas and your product may not come back in. But this wasn't just about tariffs. It was personal now. And nobody took it more personally than Michigan. We went line by line through leaked trade agreements, tariff memos, and congressional transcripts just to piece this story together. If that doesn't earn your subscription, what will? We did the work. Just hit the button. Michigan's gut punch, so we meant nothing? For decades, Michigan had absorbed Ford's layoffs, downsizing, and automation with resilience and hope. Factory towns gutted in the late 90s had slowly rebuilt. Local unions had made concession after concession, shorter breaks, frozen pensions, and two-tier wages, all for the promise of future reinvestment. That promise is now shattered. The moment Ford's Canadian deal became public, union halls erupted. So we meant nothing became the refrain. Rank-and-file workers staged walkouts in Wayne County. Mayors of auto towns penned open letters demanding answers. The state's congressional delegation scrambled to understand how such a massive strategic pivot had occurred without their input or even a heads up. For many, the betrayal cut deeper than economics. This wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was an erasure of identity. Michigan didn't just host Ford factories, it was Ford country. The company had shaped neighborhoods, funded schools, sponsored local sports teams. It was in the DNA of the region, and now, without notice, Ford had chosen another country. Community leaders were stunned. Ford had previously committed to investing in US-based EV facilities, and yet the actual dollars and infrastructure were now being routed to southern Ontario and Quebec. Workers asked, if our loyalty isn't rewarded, what was the point of holding on? The company had positioned itself as global, green, and agile. That branding worked wonders with the investor class. It also shielded them from political backlash, at least in the short term, because the higher the stock climbed, the more powerful Ford's boardroom became, and the less inclined they were to reverse course. This leads directly into a country that saw the numbers and prepared for them. Canada's perfect playbook, how Ottawa outbid Detroit. Canada did not stumble into this victory, it engineered it. The seeds were planted more than a decade ago when Ottawa began reshaping the national economy to attract advanced manufacturing, tax credits for battery production, cash incentives for job creation in green industries, streamlined environmental regulations that still protected the planet but didn't paralyze investment. These weren't reactive moves. They were preemptive strikes in a quiet economic war. Ontario and Quebec became laboratories for the post-carbon economy. They invested in workforce retraining, targeting skilled trades in automation, robotics, and EV engineering. They funded joint projects between colleges and factories to ensure graduates were not just employable, but essential. And crucially, they made it clear to multinational firms that political interference would be minimal. In Canada, business was still business. By contrast, Detroit was stuck in survival mode. Michigan slashed its education budget. It fought with unions instead of working alongside them. While Canada was courting the future, much of the American industrial belt was chasing nostalgia, fighting to bring back jobs that technology had already replaced. When Ford began weighing sites for its next-generation battery and vehicle platforms, the choice was clear. Canada wasn't just offering money, it was offering a system that worked. Cross-border trade was stable, the electric grid was cleaner and cheaper, talent pipelines were modern and aligned with industry demand, and the public, by and large, was on board. There were no culture wars over EVs in Toronto or Montreal. There was support, structure, and certainty. That certainty was something Washington never delivered, which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle: why the U.S. knew this was coming and failed to act. How Washington wasted the last 10 years. Ford's decision didn't happen in a vacuum. It filled a vacuum left behind by years of American policy inertia. Washington had a decade to prepare for the electric transition, the automation wave, and the rise of foreign competition. Instead, it kicked the can down a pothole-filled road. There was no national manufacturing strategy. Infrastructure bills were delayed or watered down. EV tax credits came late and with strings attached. Permitting reform was promised, then stalled. And every administration, Republican and Democrat alike, chose short-term messaging over long-term planning. America didn't just fall behind, it refused to run the race. Meanwhile, the private sector begged for guidance. Ford, General Motors, and others submitted roadmaps, forecasts, and requests. They asked for clarity on battery supply chain funding. They asked for consistency in emissions rules. They asked for help retraining workers into EV roles instead of laying them off. The answers were vague, delayed, or dead on arrival in Congress. And while America hesitated, Canada moved. While lawmakers argued about what was woke, Ottawa built new roads, signed trade agreements, and financed battery startups. By the time Washington noticed, the contracts were already signed. The dirt was already moved. The future had already crossed the border. The result? Not just a single deal lost, an entire phase of industrial leadership forfeited. As the story continues in the next section, the fallout will spread fast, and it will not stop at Ford. U.S. dealerships collapse from supply starvation. Across the United States, Ford dealerships are beginning to resemble ghost towns. The inventory that once lined their lots, rows of F-Series trucks, Broncos, and Explorers, is vanishing. Allocation numbers have dropped off a cliff. Dealers in Texas report receiving fewer than 10% of their typical monthly stock. Some in Michigan say they are skipping entire product lines altogether. The problem is not just scarcity, it is misdirection. The vehicles are going north. Canada, flush with new incentives, new factory pipelines, and a fresh political partnership, is now first in line. The consequences are devastating. Incentives are disappearing entirely. No more dealer cash, no more 0% financing, no more loyalty discounts. Ford Motor Credit, now tightening its lending terms, is only making matters worse. Customers walk into dealerships expecting to negotiate, only to be told there is nothing to sell and no deals to be had. The consumer relationship, once built on trust and availability, is collapsing. Some buyers are walking away from Ford entirely and turning to brands that can deliver today, not some unknown month next year. Dealership owners are caught in an impossible position. They are franchisees with no control over production or allocation, yet they are bearing the full weight of customer anger and financial loss. Floor plan financing still has to be paid. Staff must be retained. Lights must stay on. But without product, there is no revenue. Some owners are taking out personal loans just to keep doors open. Others are quietly listing their businesses for sale. Ford's Canadian strategy may make sense on a spreadsheet, but on America's roads, it is creating a retail collapse that no incentive can undo. Now that the sales floor is empty, America's workforce is ready to fill the streets. Labor uprising spreads, not just UAW. What started as a localized anger in the United Auto Workers has now burst into something larger, louder, and no longer controllable. Ford's decision to shift production to Canada lit a match, but the fire was already smoldering beneath the surface across American industry. From Iowa's meatpacking facilities to Ohio's distribution hubs, the message is the same. If Ford can do this, so can anyone. Loyalty is dead, geography is meaningless, and the worker is always the last to know. Union leaders from non-automotive sectors are now aligning with the UAW in solidarity protests. In Illinois, grain terminal workers walked off the job. In Georgia, poultry processors refused mandatory overtime in protest. It is no longer just about manufacturing, it is about betrayal. Even non-union workers are joining in, using social media to coordinate call-outs and demand transparency from employers about future offshoring plans. The question that echoes in every break room and shift change is simple. Are we next? The Biden administration is scrambling to get ahead of what looks more and more like a rolling labor revolt. Department of Labor officials have been dispatched to meet with regional leaders, but the tone is defensive. Workers do not want platitudes. They want protection. Meanwhile, Republicans are split. Some defend Ford's right to optimize production, while others, especially from Rust Belt states, are calling for economic patriotism and new trade barriers. For now, the movement remains decentralized, but powerful. Its strength lies not in leadership, but in shared resentment, a sense that American labor is being sacrificed in the name of modernization, and that no company, no matter how historic, is immune. As factories fall silent, voices are getting louder, and soon those voices reach the halls of Congress. Congress retaliates. No subsidies for traders. The political backlash has arrived, and it is bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans alike have introduced a flurry of new bills aimed directly at companies that offshore production after receiving American subsidies. The rhetoric is fiery and fast-moving. Senator Josh Hawley called Ford's move corporate betrayal funded by taxpayer dollars. Senator Sherrod Brown warned that if you take government money, you build in America, period. The message is clear. Corporate freedom does not mean freedom from consequences. One proposal would claw back electric vehicle subsidies from any automaker that builds battery components outside the United States. Another would restrict eligibility for federal fleet contracts to companies that maintain at least 80% of their production within U.S. borders. Yet another bill, still in early draft form, proposes a new classification, strategic industrial defection, labeling companies that relocate during active federal investment programs. The penalties include loss of grants, tax breaks, and in some cases, even litigation. Ford's lobbyists are working overtime to contain the damage. Meetings with committee chairs, backroom calls with governors, and a quiet push from the automotive trade groups are all underway. Their argument? Global flexibility is essential to survive. Punish us today, and you kill tomorrow's innovation. But many lawmakers are no longer buying that logic. They see Ford as the canary in the coal mine. If one iconic brand gets away with this, what stops the rest? The real fracture, though, is not just between lawmakers and corporations. It is between the federal government and its own economic strategy. For years, Washington subsidized electrification with no strings attached. Now, with factories fleeing and voters angry, Congress is trying to close a barn door long after the horse has bolted. And just as tempers rise in D.C., Ottawa delivers its response. Canada fires back. We didn't steal your jobs. The Canadian response was swift, direct, and unapologetic. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before Parliament and dismissed the U.S. backlash as a predictable result of internal dysfunction. He insisted that Canada had not poached jobs, but created an ecosystem of stability that American companies could no longer ignore. We did not steal American manufacturing, Carney said. We built what America refused to build. Canadian media echoed the sentiment. Editorials from the Globe and Mail and National Post emphasized that Canada had simply outperformed the United States on industrial readiness. While Congress fought over EV funding, Ottawa implemented it. While American unions demanded protection, Canadian provinces offered streamlined labor pacts. While the U.S. clung to legacy manufacturing zones, Canada invested in supply chain modernity. The result? Companies like Ford saw a clear, stable path to production, and they took it. Behind closed doors, however, Canadian diplomats are concerned. The threat of tariffs is real. So is the possibility of losing access to U.S. consumer markets if the political winds continue to shift. Meetings have been held with U.S. trade officials in neutral zones like Geneva and Brussels. Canada is proposing a North American Green Compact, a treaty-level agreement that would exempt EV-related manufacturing from most border restrictions in exchange for shared production quotas and worker protections. So far, the U.S. response has been cool. President Trump remains fixated on punishment. Congress remains fractured, but the longer America delays, the more Canada capitalizes. This is no longer a policy dispute. It is an identity crisis, and while Washington argues over blame, the automotive world is already moving on. The U.S.-Canada Auto Alliance is over. The handshake that once powered North America's car industry has shattered. For decades, the United States and Canada functioned like a single, seamless machine, manufacturing components in Windsor, assembling them in Detroit, shipping them across the continent without pause. That model is now broken. The new Ford-Canada deal, along with Trump's retaliatory tariff threats, has cut through the heart of the alliance like a blade. Joint manufacturing agreements are unraveling. Shared supply lines have been rerouted through exclusive Canadian corridors. Binational plant planning, once a symbol of unity, is now an operational liability. Canadian leaders no longer view the United States as a stable or reliable partner. After years of uncertainty over tariffs, emissions rules, and green tech incentives, Ottawa has stopped waiting for clarity from Washington. Instead, it is crafting its own future, one that elevates Canada from America's junior partner to a sovereign leader in electric vehicle innovation. Ontario's Ministry of Economic Development now negotiates directly with automakers, bypassing old trilateral agreements that once required American input. Quebec's investment in EV battery recycling, too, is designed to bypass U.S. dependency entirely. For the United States, the result is unmistakable. It has lost not only factories and jobs, but leverage. The integrated auto corridor between Windsor and Detroit that defined continental production in the 20th century is now just another broken pipeline in a post-alliance age. And with that alliance severed, the failure of U.S. leadership takes center stage. Washington's delay just lost the war. There were moments, brief, powerful ones, when the United States could have changed course, but none of them were seized. While Ford was already drafting cross-border investment plans with Canadian ministers, American lawmakers were still locked in partisan gridlock, arguing over permitting reform and debating whether EV subsidies were too woke for middle America. The consequence of that delay was catastrophic. By the time the tariffs were issued, the money had already moved. The production lines were already committed. The jobs were already crossing the border. What doomed America's strategy was not just slow timing. It was mismatched incentives. The U.S. offered vague tax credits. Canada offered guaranteed land, labor rebates, and energy price locks. Washington warned of betrayal. Ottawa promised scale and support. One side pandered to political optics. The other spoke directly to corporate balance sheets. The result was a mass acceleration of investment away from American soil, not just by Ford, but by every manufacturer watching the headlines. Even worse, the American response was not unified. While President Donald Trump blasted the automaker, several governors openly supported Ford's move, hoping to maintain at least some parts of the supply chain in their states. Senate Republicans called for sanctions, while House Democrats blamed Trump-era deregulation for enabling the move. The lack of strategic coordination was staggering, and by the time Washington was ready to act, introducing tariffs, drafting bills, launching inquiries, the game had already changed. Canada had cemented its position. The global auto market had adjusted, and the United States had surrendered a war it barely showed up to fight. But while America's institutions stalled, Ford itself was already transforming into something else entirely. Ford stops being a car company. In public, Ford still talks about trucks and SUVs, but internally, the company has already made the pivot. It no longer sees itself as a vehicle manufacturer. It now brands itself as a mobility platform, a term that signals something profound. In Ford's boardrooms, the future is not about building cars. It is about managing transportation ecosystems, fleets, data, software, logistics, and artificial intelligence. Physical assembly is a cost center. Digital control is the profit engine. Ford's shift began with its growing investment in telematics, software that tracks, predicts, and optimizes vehicle behavior. From there, the company expanded into fleet management tools, city-scale transportation dashboards, and subscription services tied to predictive maintenance. The more it collected data, the less it needed factories. Margins stopped depending on steel and labor and started flowing from code and connectivity. Its autonomous division, once a side project, now receives major capital injections. Ford's research teams in Ottawa and Toronto are developing algorithms for self-driving delivery pods and micromobility units. Its partnerships with Canadian telecom firms signal a long-term bet that real value lies in controlling vehicle communication networks, not just vehicle manufacturing. In short, Ford has quietly evolved into a hybrid between a logistics platform and a smart city infrastructure provider. This is no longer a company that needs America's labor force or even its geography. It needs access to cloud infrastructure, data science talent, and international regulatory partners. And none of those require a Detroit zip code. In this new reality, Ford's roots in American manufacturing are not just outdated, they are irrelevant. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth no one in Washington wants to say aloud. American car power is gone for good. The world no longer waits for Detroit. It no longer revolves around American buyers, plants, or trade shows. In this final chapter of the Ford saga, the last illusion has been shattered, that the United States remains the global epicenter of automotive innovation and output. That era is over. What has replaced it is a decentralized, technology-driven, globally diversified network in which the United States plays only a marginal role. By the third quarter of the year, Japanese exports to America were down over 60%. Korean firms redirected shipments to Europe and Southeast Asia. Canadian production ramped up, not to serve U.S. consumers, but to export to Africa and Latin America. Mexico, once America's outsourced assembly line, is becoming its own export powerhouse. The industrial map has been redrawn. Inside the United States, the symptoms of collapse are unavoidable. Dealership closures accelerate. Inventory remains scarce. Middle market consumers are priced out of both new vehicles and electric conversions. Supply chains crack under retaliatory tariffs and logistics reconfiguration. And yet the largest automakers seem undeterred because their futures no longer rely on America at all. Ford, like others, will still sell cars in the US, but it will not build its empire here. Not anymore. The real growth is overseas. The real profits are digital. The real influence lies in data control and market access, not factory towns and assembly lines. The decline of American car power is not an emergency anymore. It is history, and the world has already moved on. If you made it this far, you're not just watching, you're thinking. So now it's your turn. Drop a comment with your take. Was this a smart move by Ford or a total betrayal of America's workforce? Smash that like button if this video opened your eyes, and don't forget to subscribe.